LinkedIn presents.
I'm Morra Aarons-Mele, and this is The Anxious Achiever, the show that looks at the intersection of mental health and work, and how we can all do both better.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by Dell AI Factory with NVIDIA, which provides AI solutions that are easy to implement, secure, and tailor to your business. Visit Dell.com to learn more.
Hey, I'm Gianna Prudenti.
And I'm Jermaine Jackson Gadsden. We're the hosts of Let's Talk Offline from LinkedIn News and iHeart Podcasts.
There's a lot to figure out when you're just starting your career. That's where we come in.
Think of us as your work besties you can turn to for advice.
And if we don't know the answer, we bring in people who do, like negotiation expert Maury Taheri-Pour.
If you start thinking about negotiations as just a conversation, then I think it sort of eases us a little bit.
Listen to Let's Talk Offline on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
As I record this, I've just been crying because I got rejected from something that I thought I really wanted. It's been a really rough few months for me, and I'm feeling all kinds of anxiety and questioning decisions and my own validity and my own worth, and I feel really, really stuck. But I don't feel fragile, and I think that that is a key difference. So today, we're going to talk about how to make it through the hard stuff and actually come out stronger and thriving. People in all different kinds of industries are obsessed with resilience, right? Which is the ability to sort of rebound after a traumatic event or setback in life. And this is a really important muscle to be able to flex no matter where you live and work. It's something we struggle to build. Today's guests take that idea a step further. They both focus on the psychology of athletes, but there are lessons anyone can learn from their work. And they think about going through life successfully as about much more than just being resilient, but about being something they call anti-fragile, the ability not just to recover, but to thrive and actually improve, grow like muscles after a workout through the hardships of life that come along on our way. Dr. Nick Holton is a performance coach for professional athletes and Fortune 500 executives, and Adam Wright is the director of mental performance at the Washington Nationals Major League Baseball team. And together they founded the Anti-Fragile Academy. They speak to me about the work they do with athletes and beyond and how it applies in all of our work worlds. We started talking about the kind of coaching they do and why the lens of sports helps them do their work.
We view athletics, this is Adam's phrase that I'm just going to share for him, as sort of a Trojan horse for the science of human potential. Most people want to grow, they want to develop, they want to have relevant stuff, they want to maximize themselves. It doesn't mean they're optimizing, but they care about things that are relevant and make them feel good and that help them to grow. And all we're doing is saying, let's take something that they already love to do and let's embed these different things that are science-backed that will help them grow organically into that.
Athletes face unique challenges. They're faced with levels of stress that for many adults, they'd have a hard time dealing with it. So it's not simply just requiring, peak physical performance, but it also has to do with mental agility and focus and emotional regulation. And that dynamic environment of sport, I think, it's fast-paced, it's challenging, it's constantly evolving. I think it could be a wonderful platform to learn these skills that largely will transfer over to other areas of one's life.
What's your pitch when you're going into a company and you want to do coaching or training, and you might meet with that one executive who's like, it's just a nice to have. All this mental health stuff is a fad. I just want people to do their work. I pay them. That's why they should work hard. What are the words that move a resistant executive when aligning performance and mental health?
I'm not very good at pitches. I think those conversations to me tell a lot about someone, right, at this stage of the game. And I just, the idea that if someone can't wrap their brain around the idea of prioritizing mental health, fostering healthier, more sustainable workplace culture is good for everyone involved. I think we have to have a deeper conversation at this point because they're in denial, right? I think the research is clear, the data are clear, Like there's no logical argument against this. And the idea that a proactive approach that can attract talent, that could retain talent, that could develop talent is just good for business. It makes perfect sense. Why not have people optimize their life in general so they bring their best self to the workforce? I can't imagine a coached argument that could, overcome that rational statement.
We're not just talking about mental health. We're not talking about this fluffy, hand-wavy well-being. Like, we are talking about hard work, and we are talking about taking on stressors that are meaningful. We're not talking about easy. We're not talking about lack of resistance. We're talking about things that are meaningfully resistant, meaningfully difficult, and things that are nourishing so that you can find that sweet spot as a CEO or just sort of general employer, manager, whatever it might be. It's a win-win-win for everybody involved if and when you can do it right.
Yeah.
Beyond the Anti-Fragile Academy, which we run, I direct sports psychology for the Washington Nationals. They don't have me on site because they want me to just give hugs and they want everyone to feel good, right? It is a strategic business decision to enhance performance, to reduce costs, to build stronger, more resistant players in an organization. And the way you do that is to set a foundation of mental health.
If your audience, right, are achievers, well, where else are you going to look for peak achievement outside of the people who are the best in the world at something that is specifically devoted to competition? And then to learn from those sort of approaches and mindsets. So if you're that leader that really is like performance oriented, there is still an entry point for you here. In fact, I would argue it's even more important, right? When you look at the science around burnout and other things.
I think part of the reason why people like you, who also happen to be white men, doing what you do and framing it from a performance perspective is so powerful is because you run counter to all the fear of our emotions and also some gender coding around emotions.
Yes.
That people like me, frankly, run into a lot. Like, you're here to be like, this is hard. This is tough. We're going to make you better. And oh, by the way, you might actually have to deal with some of these things along the way. I think that's really powerful.
One of the things we talk about a lot is just try not to view some of these common challenges or problems through sort of an either or mindset or an either or lens. We think there's a lot of both and to be had here. And I think you'll hear that throughout the rest of the conversation. But that's the first instance of it right there. Say, yeah, you can do both of these things and make it workable and make it so that everyone can gain from it.
Traditionally, obviously, men have been encouraged to be stoic, showing vulnerability as a weakness. And what we're trying to show is that, like, it's just the opposite, right? Vulnerability is actually a strength, and suppressing one's emotions and not, addressing sadness or fear or grief or whatever that is actually makes you more fragile. There's an irony around this process. And I use, in terms of gender coding, talking about men in particular. Obviously, women, on the other hand, probably they face criticism for being overly emotionally expressive or engaging with emotions like anger or assertiveness. So it flips both sides, and the idea that we have to own all of this. And there is a depth and a breadth of emotional experience that we need to understand and be able to express in an appropriate way, regardless of gender. It's a human construct.
I love that. Well, so I want you to define both fragile and anti-fragile for me.
So that's a perfect segue, right? Because sometimes people hear fragile or even anti-fragile, and this is somewhat intentional on our part, but they have a very visceral reaction. In fact, I remember early on, we put up some sort of social media post or something, and we had somebody comment and respond, fragility is not a weakness, right? There was clearly some sort of sensitivity to that. We sometimes get that, but let's be clear what we mean here. Yeah, fragility would be literally a weakness, right? Like, by definition, we struggle to see where that has a lot of redeeming qualities for a human being. I understand there are a lot of things that are beautiful that also happen to be fragile. I can appreciate the nuances here. But when it comes to navigating life, well-being, human potential, quality of life, fragility isn't a great strategy. It's just not. And so what does that mean? Adversity strikes, we fall apart. It means learned helplessness. It means victim mentality. I'm not saying, again, it's not an either or. It doesn't mean I blame me or I blame we or I blame thee. It can be a both and. But generally, kind of pushing stuff onto others is not going to lead to positive change in the face of adversity. Right? So you move down the spectrum. then you have resilience, right? And so for kind of the seminal work here, Nassim Nicholas Taleb's book, Anti-Fragile, he talks about a triad, which is fragility, resilience, and anti-fragility, which we'll get to. We're going to speak to it a little bit more through the science and psychology lens. And so resilience would really break down into primarily, it's a bunch of categories, but really I'd say primarily two: robustness and buoyancy. So buoyancy is about rebounding. Adversity strikes, I take a hit, but I'm not fully fragile. I rebound. A lot of experts take issue with this notion of rebounding when you talk about resilience. The other one is robustness, which is less about a rebound and more like, can I take the hit, right, without that drop to begin it with? Okay, so that's resilience. Anti-fragility then is, there's a couple distinguishing characteristics, we'll argue. One, it's not just about bouncing back or sustaining the adversity. It's actually about leveraging it. We actually grow because of said adversity, and it is proactive, not reactive. We're talking about a capacity that we believe could be trained up, skill-based, developed in different competencies, whereas resilience, by definition, is really how we respond when something hits. We're talking about building up a capacity for when those things inevitably will hit. And to come full circle to your original question, what better place to do that than sports?
Yeah.
Also, right? Because like that's coming with adversity one way or another. Life is in general, but sports is a great context for that.
So anti-fragile is the skill that you develop to enhance resilience, or?
Yeah, the core definition for Taleb is the ability to thrive really through, and in some cases, I think because of the adversity. So embedded in it is some resilient tools, right? Resilient options, resilient behaviors, but we're talking about proactively practicing them to build up a capacity. So you go beyond buoyancy, you go beyond robustness, you get to a point within certain limitations, of course, and we can talk about, I think, just objective limitations to that. Unrelenting environments, they're called, for instance, and that's why you've got to be careful with words like victim mentality, but we can get into all those nuances. But that at least gives you a sense. Like generally what we're saying is it's not just about surviving hard stuff. You actually can thrive through it and because of it.
Think about anti-fragile systems. If you think organic systems, you can think of our immune system, right? It gets stronger when it encounters pathogens, right? It learns to defend itself more effectively in the future. Similar with muscles. What do we do when we go to the gym? We break down our muscles, and ultimately they get stronger as they get subjected to stress, and they can handle greater loads over time with proper rest. Even evolution, right? It's an anti-fragile process, right? So we're going to adapt and evolve to responses to environmental stressors and become more suited for our habitats and the context in front of us. This is a natural, I say, emergent property of most successful organic and inorganic systems.
We also see this in psychology, but it's just a little different than anti-fragility because it's happening after the fact, but it's post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And Adam talks about this a lot. That's actually the default for most humans. PTSD gets all the notoriety, understandably so. It's a serious thing, and we want those people to get help right dealing with that. But the generalization for most people that experience trauma is actually post-traumatic growth, right? They actually, in some way, shape, or form, learn something new, develop new insights, in some way say they might become better because of that thing. Now, does that mean they wish for it? No. Does that mean we're saying become anti-fragile by introducing trauma into one's life? No. But it is an example of where people can take on hard things up to certain degrees and levels and experience genuine personal growth in really transformative ways that I think don't get tapped into from other experiences, right? This is why the term psychological richness. It's not about happiness. It's not necessarily about life satisfaction. It is quality of life, but quality of life and overall life satisfaction tends to be associated with that richness, not just constant pleasantness, but also not toxicity and trauma that harms and wounds and can't be recovered from in some cases, right? We're talking about richness that kind of rounds out those edges without going to the extremes.
Can you give me an example of people who audiences might even know who exhibit anti-fragility?
Well, comedians in general. Yeah, comedians in general. So if you don't want to go to sports, so what does a comedian have to do, right? They have to get on stage, expose themselves, become vulnerable, right? To share original ideas and creativity that create positive emotion and avoid negative emotion because everyone in front of them came in expecting positive. So if they don't get it, it's going to be an even more visceral reaction, right? That's how the dopaminergic system works. So it's like, this is risky behavior, but you have to do that to sharpen the routine. There is no way to get the best jokes, the best timing, the best delivery without going through that fire, right?
Without
and in my
bombing
experience,
sometimes.
yeah, sure, maybe with bombing too. And so my experience, like whether it's documentaries or just looking at performers in general, is that like trial by fire sort of attitude, or trial and error is what Taleb would call it. And we can talk about that a little bit. Is, I think, a perfect example of anti-fragile.
I was thinking of, geez, I just got back from Portugal, and I was thinking of J.K. Rowling, who put herself out there, with her series, and, she faced countless rejections. And as a consequence of pursuing her dream, numerous personal hardships and poverty, and she was a single mother. And, she used them as motivation and inspiration for this Harry Potter series. I want to say that her life difficulties acted as a catalyst for creative and professional growth. It was a choice because she could have turned away and walked away and found something else and something easier. So while things were largely out of her control to some degree, it was a choice to stay in the fight. And I think largely that honed her and that built her. And I do think ultimately allowed for that positive change. And ultimately, obviously, one of the best series I think we have. My son, I grew up reading Harry Potter to my son. It's fantastic. But it was because of that anti-fragile behavior and her approach to getting this to the public, I think, that largely shaped that series.
Well, except I'm going to push you here. It's not lost on me that she's now one of the most hated figures because her similar passion and desire to push through in the face of constant negative feedback on the issue of trans women and being trans, I would think also is a case study maybe in what happens when you are impervious to feedback or even the feelings of other people, and you're so strident and passionate in your cause.
Well, we should be pretty clear about something. Anti-fragility has nothing to do with being liked. And if we're talking about impervious to feedback when it comes to the science of values, I'd make the argument that that's where you should be. If your values are that flexible, they're not values. Now, that doesn't mean you should be closed off. We can talk all about the science of curiosity and openness and extroversion and all those sorts of things. But when we say values, they're core beliefs, right? And to be anti-fragile has to have some element of rigidity or boundary. And if that's subject to what we call extrinsic pressures, there's a fine line between I'm so rigid that I can't open up and grow, and I'm so open that I have no sense of self, right? And I think anti-fragility, well-being, we call it coherence in the psychological world. It's about understanding what that sweet spot is and how it's guided by epistemological sources. That could be science, that could be spirituality, that could be religion, and religion and spirituality are not the same thing. It can be philosophy. I think it can be just sort of like coming up with sort of your own value systems, but there has to be some sort of operating system in place as a foundation, right? And that's ultimately, I think, what Adam's getting at is whether you like her or not, whether you agree with her or not, there is a firmness and awareness and a sense of self.
The research is in its infancy, okay, around particularly in the psychological realm and other areas in anti-fragility. It has been in existence a bit longer, but we don't know a whole lot. But I would also venture to say, as we explore more, is that it's also correlated strongly with certain personality, in terms of big five personality characteristics. And you look at somebody, like J.K. Rowling or others, that whatever line, without getting into politics, there is an openness or a closeness to ideas. And I'm sure there's some correlation there. We don't know. We haven't parsed it out yet, but I'm sure that has a lot to do with how this plays out.
I mean, we could spend the whole episode on this. I mean, it's fascinating to me. And I think a lot of listeners, including myself, are sort of like, I don't know that I would ever want to have a belief or a value system that is so strong that if I were constantly getting the feedback that I was hurting other people, I wouldn't listen to that. And when I think about a lot of the greats, and I'm thinking of someone like Novak Djokovic, they're often people who you do get that sense of like, they might not be a very good best friend. They may not be the kind of person that you might want to mentor. They are so themselves that might make it difficult for them to be in any other role. And a lot of people might say that's not for me.
Sure. I think Elon Musk, as we're speaking, right? These kind of characters. Yeah.
Is he anti-fragile or is he completely
Good
emotionally dead?
I don't know him. He's never been to my office. I can't assess him.
I know.
But I think these are all really interesting questions because underlying this, and if you look at a lot of the tools that we use, one of which I think in terms of building anti-fragility is understanding like cognitive behavior therapy 3.0, which would be acceptance commitment theory and training. A lot has to do with values. And the one thing they teach you in learning to be a therapist and somebody sitting in your office is it's one thing to treat the person who was abused. But at the same time, that person who sits in the office who is the abuser, we also have to treat them and try to understand where they're coming from. So a big part of doing this is helping people understand themselves without, we're not judging them, try to better understand their values and to self-reflect. We're trying to step away from holding judgments as opposed to spurring conversation, deep self-reflection, and a real clarification of why people engage with what they do and what are their goals. Are they value aligned?
I don't think anyone's saying don't listen or don't explore or don't examine. I hear what you're saying. It's hard to imagine beliefs that you wouldn't pivot from. But when I start saying words like loyalty and love and compassion and honesty and self-regulation or discipline or whatever, I would imagine a lot of listeners are going to hear some keywords that are like, yeah, I genuinely do hope I hold to those throughout, right? And so in this case, a totally understood controversial figure. But if those are the values that are at play for her right here, the mentally healthy thing to do for her as an individual is to try to stay aligned with those. That may not be best for kind of a larger audience or not. Again, we're not getting into that. But just from the individual psychological perspective, that's the role these values play here.
What happens when businesses have Dell AI Factory with NVIDIA? Years of patient data gets distilled in seconds. Investors know the exact moment stocks should be traded. And quality checks speed up so production lines never slow down. No matter what business you're in, there is an AI solution that's easy to implement, secure, and tailored to you that can keep your business moving forward. Dell AI Factory with NVIDIA, your way to AI. Visit Dell.com to learn more.
Hey, I'm Gianna Prudenti.
And I'm Janae Jackson Gadsden. We're the hosts of Let's Talk Offline, a new podcast from LinkedIn News and iHeart Podcasts.
When you're just starting out in your career, you have a lot of questions, like how do I speak up when I'm feeling overwhelmed?
Or, can I negotiate a higher salary if this is my first real job? Girl, yes.
Each week, we answer your unfiltered work questions.
Think of us as your work besties you can turn to for advice.
And if we don't know the answer, we bring in experts who do, like resume specialist Morgan Sanner.
The only difference between the person who doesn't get the job and the person who gets the job is usually who applies.
Yeah, I think a lot about that quote. What is it? Like you miss 100% of the shots you never take?
Yeah, rejection is scary, but it's better than you rejecting yourself.
Together, we'll share what it really takes to thrive in the early years of your career.
Without sacrificing your sanity or sleep.
Listen to Let's Talk Offline on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
I want to talk a little bit about what listeners can take away from the skills that you give people. But I want to ask you a little bit. A lot of what we talk about on this show is how anxiety can be a motivator for many people. Sometimes that's a habit. It's rarely a choice, although sometimes it is. How do you deal with anxiety as a concept and as an emotion that I would assume impacts your clients so strongly?
I'll just reiterate something I think we've kind of said, but want to say again and on repeat, which is all emotions are data. There is no such thing as good and bad emotions or positive and negative emotions. There are pleasant and unpleasant emotions, but they are all data and they all serve a purpose. And for a lot of our clients or a lot of our student athletes, sometimes just hearing that is a total mindset change or shift, whatever you call it, total reframe. It can be enough to sometimes pivot their relationship with experiences that evoke things they were otherwise avoiding previously, such as anxiety, right? But then we get into something like acceptance commitment. Adam, I'll throw it to you here.
I think we talk colloquially about these ideas, but anxiety, as you go, and I'm sure your listeners know, it's a complex term, right? And there are different types of anxiety, somatic and cognitive. And there's different systems that are working when we perceive a threat or we think our skills don't necessarily level up to what the task is in front of us. I think part of what we try to teach is that what we initially see as a threat, we need to switch and look at it as a challenge or an opportunity. That sounds like a lot of psychological woo-woo, but the truth is the research is very clear on this. When we first see something that we feel fearful about, we have the initial reaction, right, which is part of that's called the SAM system, but we don't have to get into detail. But you're getting a dump of adrenaline and noradrenaline. But depending on how we assess it, means do we get the extra cortisol, which is the secondary chronic system that really can take us down. So we say it's not the initial response that we have to the stressor, perceived stressor, it's the assessment of that stressor and our skill set. And if we could say, no, this is an opportunity change, I have the skills and I've developed them in such a way that I can overcome this obstacle, all of a sudden we reduce the cortisol, and while our heart rate is still beating, we see dilation, right, of our vessels, and we have access to that blood flow. Our physiological experience of that stressor changes. Now it is energy to engage and move forward as opposed to hide and retreat.
So put that into a real world example of someone who might get an anxiety trigger or get that trigger. That's that first warning sign.
So here's a perfect example. One player called, often it's pitchers because they're very proactive, but before every game, right, he has severe somatic anxiety. This is starting the night before. He might have, stomach issues, and he's very nervous, and he's having a headache, and wakes up in the morning, he's still feeling sick, and he's looking at that as something that's negative. He's looking at something that's going to weaken him. He's assuming that this is going to correlate with a poor performance. And we frame it in such a way and say, listen, it's natural to have butterflies in your system. We want adrenaline and cortisol. We don't want to get rid of the butterflies. We want to get them from flying chaotically to some kind of linear fashion. So the sense is we can't control it there, but we can control how we look at those butterflies. And if they're going to lift us up rather than pull us down, we know that you could perform well, even if you don't feel good. So there's an irony here, right? So learning how to better assess what we're experiencing, we call it interoception, and assessing it in such a way that anxiety now becomes energy. Now all of a sudden, that's not looked at as a sickness if there's something's wrong. That's just preparation.
For achievement-oriented audience and listeners, Adam just said it quickly, but it's important to distinguish. You can perform well even when you're feeling bad, which may sound kind of obvious, but this is what, especially sports fans will know as the clutch state. This is not necessarily, I feel good, I lose sense of time, what we call hypofrontality or transient hypofrontality. I lose sense of self, I lose sense of time. What we know is the flow state, a lot of your audience might know, right? The flow state and the clutch state empirically are different, right? Flow state's generally associated with, levels of challenge. Yeah, like a challenge skills ratio, but it's generally a very pleasant experience. A clutch state isn't, right? So again, it's this idea, just because you're experiencing this thing, and Adam can go into the different nuances of ACT, maybe you've already detailed them, but it doesn't mean you are that thing. And it doesn't mean you are incapable of responding to it in the way that's, going back to a previous part, values aligned in that moment.
So let me ask you then, if you had an athlete and it was the night before the big game, is there a better way to be flow state or clutch state? Or are you meeting them where they're at?
Wishing them to be better than they or different than they are is part of the problem.
Right.
Our idea is to recognize, accept, label, and then focus on something that's task relative, right? Action oriented and values aligned. So even asking that question, it is what it is. Accept it. This is how you feel, because largely it's unconscious. It's based upon your history and your experience and genetics and epigenetics. It doesn't matter. What matters is how we respond to it and how we use it. So we get out of our head and we get into the game. We externalize our focus.
So how would you get somebody to recognize it and use it the night before and then the morning going into the game? As a parent, as a, one of your professionals, whatever.
Recognize that it's there. Let's put a label on it. okay, for what it is. It's anxiety, but it's now it's
Yeah.
energy. And then we anchor ourselves on routines, right? We rack on habits that we know work. And the idea is the routine is not just a physical routine, it ends up being an emotional anchor. Right. So now we have agency and autonomy, and we're moving forward, and we're not just sitting still. And in that way, I think it emboldens us to move forward. Right. And then we use visualization and internal self-talk and all these other tools too. But if you don't have this foundation, this existential foundation, like to me as the primary focus, the rest of that, it's just noise. It's not going to stick. It's all going to roll off.
All right, let me ask you the harder question. I don't have a big game tomorrow. In fact, it's just preseason. And I'm feeling like I have the big game. In fact, I'm feeling like I have the big game, and I'm going to F up many hours of the day. My anxiety is not time limited or good. It's just, oh, wait, what do I do then? Because maybe it is who I am.
I would never see something as an either or, though. I think it's a both and, right?
Yeah.
So the just a wait, I think, is like, maybe it feels predominantly like a weight. I really struggle with it, so it's consistently a weight. But I would argue generally, how can we take it and help you turn it into a both and? Yeah, sometimes it's a weight, so we got to figure out how to carry it most effectively, to Adam's point. And how can we take some of that weight and ideally redirect it so we're swinging it in a way that's attack-oriented, right, or proactive, not just sort of holding and sustaining. And Adam mentioned one piece right there, which again, he said quickly, but the difference sometimes between I'm anxious versus I'm feeling anxious, right? Or I'm experiencing some anxiety, what we call diffusion, right? Just kind of separating your identity from the experience itself.
I think it's also important to note, right? I make the distinction between malfunction and dysfunction. Malfunction, I would say, is what the athlete's feeling prior to a game. If you're dealing with general dysfunction and falling into the clinical diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder, where there's this persistent excessive worry with, around kind of all aspects of various aspects of one's life, that's when we tap into a therapist, right? And that's when you get diagnosed with GAD, and perhaps we have, cognitive behavioral therapy, and perhaps we have a psychopharmacological intervention, but we have to know the difference and know ourselves and be honest and talk about it.
I think most of my listeners, certainly those who identify as anxious achievers, know the difference. They may also have a diagnosis, but it's managed. But anxiety is their fellow traveler. Like, it ain't going anywhere. And so I love what you're saying, because there is that piece of acceptance and like, let's put this to work.
If it's your co-pilot, if it's your driver and it's doing some of the navigating, then yeah, there's some chances to take you in some bad directions. But anyone that's seen Inside Out 2 lately, like it can be a good driver, sometimes literally drivers sometimes as well, right? So I'm glad your listeners know the difference, that we're not in any way, shape, or form trying to minimize it. But if you're just talking about athletes and let's say performance anxiety, not the 3 Ps, not like we call personal, permanent, and pervasive. So personal is like, do I control it or does someone else? Permanent, will it last forever or is it temporary? Pervasive, will it impact everything or just one thing? So if you land on it's just kind of localized to performance, right? In this case, it's sport oriented or test oriented, or, again, a lot of years in education. So I get it. Kids have a lot of anxieties about a lot of things. Part of me hears that situation and says, well, lucky kid that they actually get to experience high level performance anxiety in a low risk situation.
Mm-hmm.
Better than all of a sudden getting it for the first time, where it genuinely is high risk, where the scout's watching, where you need to hit for whatever, right? Get your average, like show them your power hitter, show them your arm, whatever it might be. I would personally rather have it, and I would frame it as, cool, now we get an opportunity to practice in what factually, objectively is a low risk scenario. I appreciate and honor your anxiety, and we're going to look at ways to kind of let it in and respond to it. But objectively, your anxiety doesn't get to dictate that this is high risk. This is objectively low risk, right? It is what it is. So let's let it in, but let's acknowledge the reality of the situation. And let's find a way to make them work together.
Is that helping you become anti-fragile, that practice?
I would argue that's very anti-fragile, because ultimately it's about adaptability and challenge mindsets, opportunity mindsets. Again, not in the face of unrelenting environments, but in the face of sort of like manageable challenges and opportunities for positive stressors. So with that scenario, right, what might make that anxiety, but a low risk game the next day, more or less manageable? Well, some of it is the perception. We'll talk about like biopsychosocial. So some of it is the perception. How am I thinking about this? Do I think I have tools to use my anxiety here? Do I think I have tools to combat some of my inner narrative, right? Do I think I know some of the ACT skills? If the answer to that is yes, I might approach that anxiety in that game with a lot more confidence than if I've never received any training or had any experience, right? Just in the same way, a kid stepping up to pitch who's never pitched before, like I was just having this conversation with an athlete yesterday. She said she's playing a new position. Okay, this is a D1 athlete. She's playing a new position. Is completely out of position. She's doing it at a top program, right? That's had a lot of success. She's a first year. She wants to impress people. And she says to me, I'm not confident. And I said, how long have you been playing this sport? She said, 18 years. And I said, you've never played this position? She said, correct. And I said, then why the hell would you be confident?
Right.
Right? Like that's actually arrogance, right? And so some of it is the internal talk. Some of it is the way we prepare our bodies. And then some of it is the outside influences, biopsychosocial, right? So the environmental influences that potentially put a ceiling on these things, coaching, parenting, mentorship, but all of these things would impact the way that the athlete or the student athlete experiences that scenario. It's not just kind of predetermined, right? There's a lot of control.
Totally.
I think confidence is an interesting term because it's such a fickle friend, right? And the idea is, particularly with confidence, it's like, okay, what do we mean by anti-fragile confidence? Well, it's not attached to outcome. And that's where we get into trouble. And that's what gets into that maladaptive perfectionism. It's attached to the process, right? I know the steps and strategies. I know the behaviors involved to learning and getting better. And I've used it my entire life. And I stay process focused and prioritizing, mastering the skills, improving my performance, learning from my experiences in both positive and negative, right? Regardless of the immediate result. Like that's true confidence.
So with that athlete, right, what did we do? It wasn't just kind of blowing positive smoke at her and say, oh, rah, rah, you can do this, right? Just right. Visualize yourself having success. She's never played this position, right? Listen, you need to be doing 5 to 7 days of an hour's worth of film study. You need to be getting extra sessions in, with your assistant coaches. You need to be getting out and doing personal technical work for different types of ball strikes and whatever else it might be that you don't do from your traditional positions, right? Like, those are all things that are process-oriented, under your control. And then we need to acknowledge you ultimately do not have control. The coach gets to decide, right? You have to put in the steps each day that are values aligned, that are process-oriented, that allow you to adapt to the highest probability possible. And then what is outside of your control, there has to be some release. There has to be some letting go and acceptance.
I want to talk a little bit about dealing with that inner critic and dealing with the pressure of an outcome. I think that if I had to put one issue that I hear from my listeners and the people I work with to the fore, it's I'm my own worst enemy. How do you begin to work with that? Because I would assume you have clients who've gotten pretty far by punishing themselves every single day.
I went to graduate school. I lost track at this point, probably for 10 years, to learn to help people get out of their own way. Everything I learned for 10 years, that's basically what I've learned how to do, because this is the essence of it. We are our worst enemies, particularly at the highest levels of performance. People who really do operate at the razor's edge.
Say that again, please. I want everyone to hear that.
It truly is. We're our worst enemies. And it's not about convincing ourselves otherwise. It's about understanding ourselves, understanding those unconscious motivations, resistances, the repetition compulsions, those behaviors we would constantly do over and over again that serve a purpose, even though it doesn't seem like it. Why do I keep sabotaging myself? Well, there's a reason. It's not random. Like, let's take the time and discover what's really going on behind the scenes, so we know what we do when we're back on stage, right? So I think we really have to become aware of our demons and our history to some degree, to how to move forward with our present and looking to the future. And a great deal of that has to do with talking about it, has to do with understanding ourselves and taking the time. But once you have that in place, then that's why these wonderful systems like acceptance commitment therapy help us move forward, because we recognize those aspects of ourselves that largely are trying to protect us, right? They go back to childhood. We're not going to get rid of them. I always say, do you want me to cut out your amygdala? We're like, because that's not what we're going to do. Let's cut out our limbic system. Like, well, if you want your brain intact, well, then we have to accept all aspects of ourselves, that they all serve a purpose at different times and contexts in our lives. But maybe those narratives are no longer useful. Maybe they were useful 20 years ago. Let's revisit and recreate a new narrative moving forward, even if it doesn't feel true.
Right, because it won't.
It might not. We're going to try this on for a while. It won't, of course. But that doesn't mean it's wrong if it is value aligned.
Yeah, that last piece is interesting. There's arguments to be had sometimes about whether behaviors lead to identity or identity leads to behaviors. And it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg piece, right?
Yeah.
Well, I will say this, though, that so keep it like with Adam and I's, we kind of have a Venn diagram in terms of our expertise, but where they don't overlap, Adam has his master's in mental health counseling, right? He does this sort of work on very serious levels with a variety of different clients. I'm coming at it more from a well-being, pause psych, human flourishing lens. So I don't really touch, he's talking about the subconscious and sometimes therapeutic interventions, right? From my world, the most relevant thing is just self-compassion. Like you said, I got this far by punishing myself. They need to look at Kristen Neff's work, Neff. Maybe you've already talked about Kristen on the show. Maybe you've had her on. Great. Perfect. Okay. So like go to that episode, right, with Kristen Neff and review basically everything she says, because it's wonderful research. And it's a little paradoxical, kind of like that. You want better outcomes, focus on process, right? You want to kind of deal with some of the hardness, the rigidness, the perfectionism. You actually need to practice a little bit more compassion for yourself in a lot of cases. I don't mean to generalize that to all situations.
I know people hate the word self-compassion.
Hate it. Allergic to it.
This is where we do have to sell a little bit. We need to repackage this a little bit. For athletes, I'd say, well, would you coach your 10-year-old self or a 10-year-old? Would you say these things to a 10-year-old? You'd be much more kind. Okay, talk to yourself that way. It's like, are you human? Do you share common humanity, right? Suffering, this is part of the shared human experience. Okay, if you're human, then self-compassion works. And what about, are you mindful, which is the third component of self-compassion? What do you mean? Like, do you engage in the world sometimes with thoughts and feelings, without judgment? Yeah. Well, can you observe your emotions? Yeah. Can you be open to understanding what you're experiencing? Yeah. Okay. Do you have to suppress everything that comes up? No, I could. Well, then you can be self-compassionate. But we have to be careful of the words that we use, particularly with these high-level performers, because they think it's going to make them soft, it's nonsensical. It's actually going to make you fragile.
That's right. This is a little bit of a tangent, but indulge me for a minute. I mean, I heard you talking about your 10-year-old self. Obviously, our 10-year-old self shows up even at the very highest levels of our career. I'm curious if you ever do sort of parts work or encourage these high performers to look into, the pieces of them that might be stuck, either through internal family systems frameworks and like how that goes over. Because again, it's to me something that seems obvious, especially those of us who've been playing a sport since we're kids. There's a piece of us often that is, we're still trying to please our dad.
Yeah, of course.
So I'm just curious how that comes into your work.
Well, yeah, so the closest I get to it is really how can we use some of those past experiences to help you understand things so there's sort of a scale from, think of it as curiosity as a starting point, to situational interest, to sustained interest, to deep engagement, to some flow states here and there, to full on passion, right? But even with passion and the science of passion, there's a distinction that you just mentioned. Obsessive passion, right? I'm passionate about this thing because I have to prove something to daddy, right? Or mommy or whoever it is, right? That's not the same affective experience as harmonious of passion, where it's aligned with sense of purpose, self-determination theory, intrinsic motivators, lots of pleasant emotion. That's where you're going to get a lot of flow states and this if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life, sort of like cliche. But that's where we would enter it, right? I would generally not, unless I was asking somebody to go back and kind of use that to inform future positive, right? Like positive data, we might say. I would not do a retrospective. That would be more something kind of in Adam's area. And even then we're teetering, I think, right on the line of therapy.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know how familiar your listeners are with IFS, understanding these concepts of some of these different therapies and these managers and exiles and firefighters and all these concepts. The truth is there's multiple roads to Rome. There are a lot of ways to accept, right? And be in harmony with an integrated self, right? That's one method among many. It's just a theory, by the way. There's no manager, exiles, firefighters in a brain. It's metaphoric, right? Just like id, ego, superego, right? There are many ways that all these theorists are effectively trying to do the same things. Our idea is let's explore the vast literature out there across silos and take as much as we can and introduce it to people before they become ill, before they become depressed, before they become, get some kind of diagnosis. Let's do it proactively, because most people don't engage with any of these ideas until they get sick and they go to a doctor, they go to a therapist. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. These are wonderful roadmaps. We could all engage with these ideas without actually being pathologized. It's cut the human experience, right? So learning to navigate it and use it in a way and maybe present it with different wording and language. But, I think our goals are all the same: psychological flexibility, emotional agility, inner harmony, and integration, so we can move forward to our value-based goals, period.
I want to close out on something that you've mentioned a lot, and I think is one of the hardest things for people to do also, in addition to shutting down their own head, which is enjoying the process and not getting fixated on that outcome. Give me a lab here. How do we begin to think about that?
So whether it's kind of the psychological lens or the neuroscience lens, the outcomes that they care about most should be chunked and broken down into the smallest pieces possible. And then to regulate the dopamine reward system and keep kind of the sustained drive with some of those things, really two things need to happen. There needs to be some sort of practice where the wins along the way are intentionally recognized and savored, downloaded, to use Dr. Rick Hansen's term, right? Negative stuff sticks very easily, positive stuff less so. Got to celebrate the wins. And then number two is provide oneself with incrementally satisfying rewards as you scale up those wins. Psychologically, neuroscientifically, one of the kind of best ways to scale that up and down and to literally enjoy the process, step by step by step by step, and then pay attention to what you're doing along the way. The rest ideally will take care of itself, or it won't, and there was nothing you could do about it if you put in the work, right?
And even so, you could still embrace every step, right? Each effort. You could embrace every moment and see it as valuable regardless of the outcome.
Really?
Yeah. And if you're not, you're really, I think you're missing out.
That's it for today's show. Our show is produced and edited by Mary Dew. Our assistant producer and sound engineer is Nick Krinko. Many thanks to the LinkedIn Presents family, to all of our guests for sharing their stories, and to our advertisers who bring you the show. If you love The Anxious Achiever, tell your friends. Subscribe, leave a review, follow us. You can also tweet me at Morra AM or find me on LinkedIn, where you can follow me, message me, or subscribe to my newsletter for more from the Anxious Achiever world. Thanks for listening.